Chapter 7. Yet all this was only the prologue of the actual Dunwich horror. Formalities were gone through by bewildered officials, abnormal details were truly kept from press and public, and men were sent to Dunwich and Aylesbury to look up property and notify any who might be heirs of the late Wilbur Whately. They found the countryside in great agitation, both because of the growing rumblings beneath the domed hills and because of the unwanted stench and the surging, lapping sounds which came increasingly from the great empty shell formed by Whately's boarded-up farmhouse. Earl Sawyer, who tended the horse and cattle during Wilbur's absence, had developed a woefully acute case of nerves. The officials devised excuses not to enter the noisome boarded place, and were glad to confine their survey of the deceased's living quarters and the newly mended sheds to a single visit. They filled a ponderous report at the courthouse in Aylesbury, and litigations concerning heirship are said to be still in progress amongst the innumerable Whateleys, decayed and undecayed, of the upper Miskatonic Valley. An almost indeterminable manuscript in strange characters, written in a huge ledger and adjusted a sort of diary because of the spacing and the variations in ink and penmanship, presented a baffling puzzle to those who found it on the old bureau which served as its owner's desk. After a week of debate, it was sent to Miskatonic University, together with the deceased's collection of strange books, for study and possible translation, but even the best linguists soon saw that it was not likely to be unriddled with ease. No trace of the ancient gold with which Wilbur and old Whately always paid their debts had not yet been discovered. It was in the dark of September 9th that the horror broke loose. The hill noises had been very pronounced during the evening, and dogs barked frantically all night. Early risers on the 10th noticed a peculiar stench in the air. About 7 o'clock, Luther Brown, the hired boy at George Corey's, between Cold Spring Glen and the village, rushed frenziedly back from his morning trip to 10-acre meadow with the cows. He was almost convulsed with fright as he stumbled into the kitchen, and in the yard outside the no less frightened herd were pawing and lowing pitifully. Having followed the boy back in the panic they shared with him. Between gasps, Luther tried to stammer out his tale to Mrs. Corey. "Up there, in the road beyond the glen, Miss Corey, there's something been there. Smells like thunder, and all the bushes and little trees pushed back from the road. They look like a house been moved off along it. That ain't the worst, no. They's prints in the road, Miss Corey. Great round prints as big as barrelheads, all sunk down deep like an elephant had been along. Only they's a sight more than 4 feet could make. I looked at 1 or 2 before I run, and I see everyone was covered with lines spreading out from one place, like as if big palm leaf fans, twice or 3 times as big as any they is. It'd been pounded down onto the road. The smell was awful, like what it was around Wizard Whately's old house." Here he faltered and seemed to shiver afresh with the fright that had sent him flying home. Miss Corey, unable to extract more information, began telephoning the neighbors, thus starting on its rounds the overture of panic that heralded the major terrors. When she got Sally Sawyer, housekeeper at Seth Bishop's, the nearest place to Whately's, it became her turn to listen instead of to transmit, for Sally Boy's Chauncey, who slept poorly, had been up on the hill towards Whately's and dashed back in terror after one look at the place and the pasturage where Bishop's cows had been left out all night. "Yes, Miss Corey," came Sally's tremulous voice over the party wire. "Chauncey, he just came back a-posting and couldn't half talk for being scared. He says old Whately's house is all blowed up, with the timbers scattered round like they'd been dynamite inside. Only the bottom floor ain't, though. But it's all covered with a kind of tar-like stuff that smells awful and drips down off in the edges into the garden where the side timbers blowed away. And they's awful kind of marks in the ground, too. Great round marks, bigger round than a hogshead, and all sticky with stuff like is on the blowed-up house. Chauncey says he leads off in the meadows where a great swath of weather and a barn is matting down, and all the stone walls tumbled every which way wherever it goes. And says he, Miss Corey, as how he sought to look for Seth's cows, frightened as he was, and found him in the upper pasture nigh the Devil's Hop Yard in awful shape. Half of 'em clean gone, and nigh half of them that's left has sucked most dry blood, with sores on 'em that looks like they've been on Whately's cattle ever since the Lavinia's black brat was born. Since he's gone around now, look at 'em, the whole valley weren't cared to get very nigh Wizard Whately's.
Chancey didn't look careful to see what the big matted down swath led arter half the pasturage, but he says he thinks it pinned towards the glen road to the village. I tell you, Miss Corey, they's something abroad as hadn't orter be abroad, as I for one think that Black Wilbur Whately has come to the bad end he deserved, is at the bottom of the breeding of it. He wasn't all human himself. I always says to everybody, and I think he old Whately must have raised something in that there nailed off house as ain't even so human as he was. They always been unseen things around Dunwich, living things, as ain't human ain't good for human folks. The ground was talking last night, and towards morning, Chancey, he heard the whippoorwill so loud in the Cold Spring Glen he couldn't sleep none. Then he thought he heard another faint-like sound towards Wizard Whately's, kind of ripping or tearing the wood, like some big box or crate was being opened fur off. With this and that, he didn't get to sleep at all till sunup, and no sooner was he up this morning, but he's got to go over Whately's and see what's the matter. You see enough, I tell you, Miss Corey, this don't mean no good, and I think all the men folks ought to get up a party and do something. I know something's awful about, and I feel my time is nigh, though only God knows just where that is. Did your Luther take account of where the big tracks led now? No? Well, Miss Corey, if they was on the Glen Road this side of the Glen, and ain't got to your house yet, I calculate they must go in the Glen itself. They would do that. I always says Cold Spring Glen ain't no healthy nor decent place. The whippoorwills and fireflies there never did act like they was characters of God, and they's them that says you can hear strange things rushing and talking in the air down there if you stand in the right place, between the rock falls and Bear's Den.
By that moon, fully 3/4 of the men and boys of Dunwich were trooping over the roads and meadows between the new-made Whately ruins and Cold Spring Glen, examining in horror the vast monstrous prints and the maimed bishop cattle, the strange, noisome wreck of the farmhouse, and the bruised, matted vegetation of the fields and roadsides. Whatever had burst loose upon the wind had assuredly gone down to the great sinister ravine, for all the trees on the banks were bent and broken, and a great avenue had been gouged and the precipice hanging underbrush. It was as though a house, launched by an avalanche, had slid down through the tangled growths of the almost vertical slope. From below, no sound came, but only a distant, undefinable fodder. And it is not to be wondered at the time the men preferred to stay on the edge and argue rather than descend and beard the unknown cyclopean horror in its lair. 3 dogs that were with the party had barked furiously at first, but it seemed cowed and reluctant when near the glen. Someone telephoned the news to the Aylesbury Transcript, but the editor, accustomed to wild tales from Dunwich, did no more than concoct a humorous paragraph about it, an item soon afterward reproduced by the Associated Press. That night everyone went home, and every house and barn was barricaded as stoutly as possible. Needless to say, no cattle were allowed to remain in open pasturage. About 2 a.m, a frightful stench and the savage barking of the dogs awakened the household at Elmer Fry's, on the eastern edge of the Cold Spring Glen, and all agreed that they could hear a sort of muffled swishing or lapping sound from somewhere outside. Miss Fry proposed telephoning the neighbors, and Elmer was about to agree when the noise of splintering wood burst in upon their deliberations. It came, apparently, from the barn, and was quickly followed by a hideous screaming and stamping amongst the cattle. The dogs slavered and crouched close to the feet of the fear-numbed family. Fry lit a lantern through force of habit, but knew it would be death to go into that black farmyard. The children and womenfolk whimpered, kept from screaming by some obscure, vestigial instinct of defense, which told them their lives depended on silence. At last the noise of the cattle subsided to a pitiful moaning, and a great snapping, crashing, and crackling ensued. The Frys, huddled together in the sitting room, did not dare to move until the last echoes died away far down in Cold Spring Glen. Then, amidst the dismal moans from the stable and the demonic piping of late whippoorwills in the glen, Selina Fry tottered to the telephone and spread what news she could of the second phase of the horror. Next day, all the countryside was in a panic, and cowed, uncommunicative groups came and went where the fiendish thing had occurred. 2 titan swaths of destruction stretched from the glen to the Fry farmyard. Monstrous prints covered the bare patches of ground, and to one side of the old red barn had completely caved in. Of the cattle, only a quarter could be found and identified. Some of these were in curious fragments, and all that survived had to be shot. Earl Sawyer suggested that help be asked from Aylesbury or Arkham, but others maintained it would be of no use. Old Zebulon Whately, of a branch that hovered about halfway between soundness and decadence, made darkly wild suggestions about rites that ought to be practiced on the hilltops. He came of a line where tradition ran strong, and his memories of chanting in the great stone circles were not altogether connected with Wilbur and his grandfather. Darkness fell upon a stricken countryside too passive to organize for real defense. In a few cases, closely related families would band together and watch in the gloom of under one roof. But in general, there was only a reputation of the barricading of the night before, and a futile, ineffective gesture of loading muskets and setting pitchforks handily about. Nothing, however, occurred except some hill noises, and when the day came, there were many who hoped that the new horror had gone as swiftly as it come. There were even bold souls who proposed an offensive expedition down the glen, though they did not venture to set an actual example to the still reluctant majority. When night came again, the barricading was repeated, though there was less huddling together of families. In the morning, both the Fry and the Seth Bishop households reported excitement among the dogs and vague sounds and stenches from afar, while early explorers noted with horror a fresh set of the monstrous tracks in the roads skirting Sentinel Hill. And before the sides of the road shewed a bruising indicative of the blasphemously stupendous bulk of the horror, whilst the conformation of the tracks seemed to argue a passage in two directions, as if the moving mountain had come from Cold Spring Glen and returned it along the same path. At the base of the hill, a 30-foot swath of crushed shrubbery and saplings led steeply upward, and the seekers gasped when they saw that even the most perpendicular places did not deflect the inexorable trail. Whatever the horror was, it could scale a sheer stony cliff of almost complete verticality, and as the investigators climbed around to the hill's summit by safer routes, they saw that the trail ended, or rather reversed, there. It was here that the Whateleys used to build their hellish fires and chant their hellish rituals by the table-like stone on May Eve and Hallowmas. Now that very stone formed the center of vast space thrashed around by the mountainous horror, whilst upon its slightly concave surface was a thick and foetid despot of the same tarry stickniness observed on the floor of the ruined Whately farmhouse where the horror escaped. Men looked at one another and muttered, when they looked down the hill. Apparently, the horror had descended by a route much the same as that of its ascent. To speculate was futile. Reason, logic, and normal ideas of motivation stood confounded. Only one Zebulon who was not with the group could have done justice to the situation or suggested a plausible explanation. Thursday night began much like the others, but it ended less happily. The whippoorwills in the glen had screamed with such unusual persistence that many could not sleep, and at about 3 a.m. all the party telephones rang tremulously. Those who took down their receivers heard a fright-mad voice shriek out, "Help! Oh my God!" And some thought a crashing sound followed off the breaking of the exclamation. There was nothing more. No one dared to do anything, and no one knew till morning whence the call came. Then those who had heard it called everyone on the line, and when a hastily assembled group of armed men crouched out to the Fry place at the head of the glen. It was horrible, yet hardly a surprise. There were more swaths and monstrous prints, but there was no longer any house. It had caved in like an eggshell, and amidst the ruins nothing living or dead could be discovered. Only a starch, a stench, and tartary sickness. The Elmer Frys had been erased from Dunwich.